Since I can remember, my mother has never hidden who her favorite was: Lorena, the firstborn, the daughter who, according to her, was born to shine. Meanwhile, I was always the shadow, the second choice, the one who didn't have much to offer. When Lorena got married and moved to an upscale neighborhood, my mother never tired of showing off photos of her luxurious home and telling everyone how proud she was. And me? Well, my achievements were treated as obligations. I graduated, started my own business, and all I heard was, "That's the least you should be doing." But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the day I came home and saw my belongings piled in garbage bags in the backyard. My mother was in the bedroom, reorganizing the space that used to be mine. Her voice echoed down the hallway as she dragged the furniture. "I need to make room for Lorena. She's going to be staying here for a while," she said, not even noticing my presence at the door. When she finally saw me, her face flushed from the effort of moving the bed. She didn't miss the chance to hurt me. "You've never been useful for anything, Adriana. At least your sister knows how to do something worthwhile with her life." I should have been used to words like these, but that day, they cut deeper. Not because they were different from what I'd heard before, but because they made it clear I would never have her love. To my mother, I was just a temporary tenant, someone disposable once the real star decided to return. I left without saying a word. I went to the backyard and started sorting through what was left of my things. Among the crumpled clothes and items tossed carelessly, I felt the anger rising within me. But along with the anger came something stronger, a quiet determination. I wasn't going to beg for anything. As I dragged my boxes to the car, I noticed my mother hadn't even bothered to help. She was still in the bedroom, humming, as if she were doing something grand. And for the first time, I thought, what's Lorena really doing here? I know that to my mother, she's the perfect daughter. But for someone who's supposedly so successful, why would she come back to this cramped house? Something didn't add up. And her expression when she saw me last time didn't either. Lorena always loved to show she was on top, but that day, there was something about the way she avoided looking directly at me. Something I couldn't yet decipher, but that deeply unsettled me. I kept that doubt to myself as I shut the car door. Something was wrong, and I was about to find out. I returned to my mother's house the next day to collect the rest of my things. Despite the anger I felt, something kept pulling me back. Maybe it was the urge to confirm that nagging feeling I'd had last time. Or maybe it was just stubbornness, a need to see how far my mother would go to please Lorena. When I walked in, I immediately noticed the house was different. My old bed was in the hallway, leaning against the wall, and the room that used to be mine was now filled with Lorena's belongings. She had brought so many bags that there was barely room to walk. Everything seemed excessive: expensive purses, shoe boxes, even a small golden mirror that reminded me of ones I'd seen in antique shops. My mother was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, but Lorena was nowhere in sight. I took the opportunity to go upstairs and grab the last boxes in the upper room. When I entered, the place was empty, except for a few crumpled clothes that had been thrown on the floor. I quickly gathered my things, but as I descended, I heard voices coming from the living room. It was Lorena. She was on the phone, her tone unfamiliar. I stopped midway down the stairs, not wanting to interrupt, but soon realized she didn't know I was there. Her laughter echoed through the house, but it wasn't cheerful. It was forced, almost mocking. "Of course I only came back to this old house because I have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you think I like this? This town? This house? It's all a nightmare." My heart raced, and I gripped the railing to steady myself. "Yes, I have a plan. I'll convince Mom to take out a loan in her name. It's easy. She believes everything I say. After that, I'm gone for good." A chill ran through me. It wasn't just what she said, but the way she said it. The coldness, the disdain for everything and everyone, including our mother. who did everything for her. I felt paralyzed, as if reality were crumbling before me. I quietly descended the rest of the stairs and slipped out the back door without anyone noticing. On the drive home, my mind was a whirlwind. How could Lorena be so heartless? And my mother? How could she not see it? I sat on the couch in my small apartment, trying to organize my thoughts. Lorena wasn't just broke. She was planning to use our mother to get out of the mess she'd created. But the worst part was knowing my mother would go along with it without question. After all, Lorena was the perfect daughter, and I was just Adriana. Something had to be done. I couldn't let this happen. But before taking action, I needed proof. If my mother was blind enough to ignore the signs, then I would have to show her the truth in a way she couldn't deny. I just didn't realize how far I'd have to go to do it. The following days felt like watching a slow-motion horror movie. I knew exactly what was going to happen, but couldn't stop it. My mother, completely enchanted by Lorena, did everything to please her. When I stopped by to pick up a document I had forgotten, I overheard the two of them talking in the living room, and my suspicions were confirmed. "Mom, you're the only person I can trust. The bank is holding my money because of a processing error. But they said if I can get a guarantor, everything will be resolved in a week." My mother, as always, didn't hesitate. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need, Mommy's here." I stayed outside, listening as Lorena carefully manipulated every word, every gesture, to get what she wanted. My heart was at war. I wanted to storm in and yell, reveal everything I knew, but my mother would never believe me. Not without proof. That very afternoon, my mother went to the bank with Lorena. By evening, they were both glowing as if they had accomplished something grand. Lorena, wearing a triumphant smile, dined calmly while my mother went on and on about how wonderful it was to help her daughter out of a tough situation. I could barely look at them. While my mother basked in her fantasy of being a heroic mother, Lorena played the role of the innocent victim perfectly. Each of her laughs burned me inside, but I stayed silent. I knew I had to act quickly. I decided to investigate. If Lorena was truly broke, there would be records somewhere. I started discreetly digging into everything I could: social media, old documents, even the trash Lorena carelessly left lying around. It didn't take long to find what I needed. Among crumpled papers in one of Lorena's bags, I found a bank statement that said it all. Her account wasn't just empty, it was drowning in debt. Each line screamed the truth she was trying to hide. I spent hours staring at those numbers, feeling a mix of anger and relief. That night, back at my apartment, I sat at the table with the documents spread out in front of me. I finally had the proof I needed. But doubt consumed me. How would my mother react? And Lorena? Would they finally see what was happening? Or would they find a way to justify the unjustifiable? I knew I couldn't delay any longer. It was time to confront the truth, even if it meant facing my mother's rejection once again. With the documents in hand, I returned to the house where I grew up. It was a quiet late afternoon, and the cold wind seemed to conspire with my state of mind. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it echoed through the hallways of the old house. Each step I took was a reminder of what I was about to do. My mother greeted me at the door with the same cold, disinterested look as always. There was no longing, not even curiosity. To her, I was a nuisance, a distraction from the pedestal where Lorena gloriously stood. "What do you want now, Adriana?" she asked with an impatient sigh. I gripped the envelope tightly, fighting the urge to throw it in her face. But I knew I needed to stay calm, or everything would be in vain. Without asking permission, I stepped inside and placed the envelope on the living room table. "Read it," I said firmly. "Read it all and then tell me if you still believe Lorena is the perfect daughter you've always thought she was." She hesitated, looking at me as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. But curiosity finally won. She opened the envelope with slow, almost ceremonial movements and began to examine the papers. Each line seemed to drain the color from her face. This can't be true. Lorena would never lie to me. She not only lied, but used you, I snapped, unable to contain my anger. She's not dealing with a banking issue. She's broke, drowning in debt, and you just got yourself into debt to help someone who only came back because she had nowhere else to go. She stood abruptly, the papers falling from her hands like leaves in the wind. For the first time, I saw something that resembled shock, maybe even shame on her face. "Adriana, how dare you?" Her voice trembled, but it wasn't anger. It was fear. "I dared because you needed to know the truth, and now you do. I just hope it's enough to open your eyes." I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. Before leaving, I turned back to look at my mother one last time. She seemed smaller, almost fragile, standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the evidence of Lorena's betrayal. Outside, I took a deep breath. There was no victory in that moment, only a weight lifted off my shoulders. I knew this was just the beginning. Lorena was still there, and my mother would have to confront her. But that part wasn't up to me. As I walked away from the house, my mind was already thinking about what would come next. I had done my part. Now it was time to see if my mother had the courage to do hers. I wasn't there to witness the moment the truth exploded inside that house, but the consequences soon reached my ears. It didn't take long for my mother to call me, her voice filled with desperation and anger. She didn't apologize, didn't admit I was right. She only told me, between sobs and shouting, that Lorena had confessed everything. "She said she had no choice," my mother cried, as if that excuse could erase everything that had happened. "She was desperate, Adriana. You don't understand how much she suffered." My silence was my answer. I knew arguing with her would be pointless. Even though Lorena had admitted the truth, my mother was still trying to find a way to justify the unjustifiable. What surprised me, however, was Lorena's reaction. According to my mother, she didn't apologize, didn't show any remorse. On the contrary, she defended herself as she always did, with arrogance and superiority. "I didn't do anything wrong. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. I did what I had to do to survive." My mother cried as she recounted how the two of them had fought. For the first time, Lorena made it clear that she never wanted to come back to that house, that she was only there because she had no other choice. My mother, humiliated and hurt, realized too late that she had sacrificed everything for someone who didn't value her. I imagined the scene perfectly. Lorena in the middle of the living room, proud and defiant, as if she were above it all, while my mother tried to piece together the truth she had refused to see for so long. I couldn't feel pity. Not for Lorena, and certainly not for my mother. Even so, that call affected me more than I wanted to admit. Despite everything, I knew my mother was dealing with something she had never expected. The truth I brought had shattered her illusion of perfection, and that in itself was a bitter victory. In the days that followed, the silence was deafening. Neither my mother nor Lorena tried to contact me again. I knew they were facing their own battles, but I didn't feel the need to get involved. For the first time, it felt like things were balancing out, even if in a chaotic way. Meanwhile, my life moved forward. My business was thriving, and I began planning a move. I needed a fresh start, something that symbolized everything I had achieved on my own. Leaving that house behind for good was a necessary step, and deep down, I knew my mother would eventually reach out to me again. The only question was, when? Boxes were scattered across the floor, and I felt relieved, though exhausted. The move was more than a physical step. It was a milestone in my life. I was leaving behind the modest apartment where I built my first dreams to move into a penthouse in one of the city's best buildings. It was more than a new address. It was the symbol of everything I had achieved, alone. In the middle of organizing, I heard the doorbell ring. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, there was my mother. Her face looked older, as if the past few days had drained all the energy she used to radiate when talking about Lorena. For a moment, she hesitated, as if she didn't know what to say. "You're moving?" she asked, looking at the boxes. "I am," I replied firmly, crossing my arms. "But why?" I took a deep breath. It was a simple question, yet so loaded with layers that my answer felt heavier than it should have been. My business made $1 million profit. I bought a penthouse in a high-end building. It's time to take the next step. She blinked a few times, as if trying to process what I had just said. Then something lit up in her eyes. Hope. Not for me, but for what she imagined this might mean for her. "Can I come with you? I know I've made mistakes, Adriana, but maybe we could start over, as mother and daughter." Those words, spoken so softly, made me close my eyes for a moment. It wasn't the request I wanted to hear. It wasn't the sincere apology I had waited for all these years. It was an attempt to keep the cycle going, to escape the consequences of her choices. "Mom, I have no doubt that you love Lorena. And I also don't doubt that, in some way, you love me in your own way. But the truth is, for a long time, you made a choice. It was always her, and I was just the consequence of that blind love." She began to cry, but I continued. I had to fight to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And when that didn't happen, I learned to survive without your approval. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. You need to understand that love shouldn't be selective. Children shouldn't have to compete for their parents' love as if it were a prize. She tried to say something, but I raised my hand, asking for silence. "I don't hate you, Mom. But I love myself enough not to carry the weight of your choices anymore. This move is my new beginning. It's the life I built on my own. And if we're ever going to rebuild something between us, it needs to start with respect and truth." The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was as if everything that had never been said had finally found its place. My mother nodded slowly, as if the words were beginning to sink in. "I'm sorry, Adriana," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. I simply walked her to the door, leaving her with her own thoughts. I knew she had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time, I felt light. Free. I returned to the boxes and continued packing. My new life was waiting, and I was ready to embrace it. The view from my new penthouse was spectacular. At night, the city lights sparkled like an inverted blanket of stars, and the distant sound of traffic was a symphony of life in motion. It was strange, but for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Not because I was above it all, but because I had finally created a space where the past couldn't touch me. This new beginning wasn't just physical. It was emotional. The move didn't erase what I had lived through, but it gave me the chance to build something that was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture I chose, every painting I hung, was a reminder that the path to this moment had been paved by my own hands. My mother didn't reach out in the days that followed, and honestly, I didn't expect her to so soon. The last time we saw each other, she seemed confused, lost in her own regrets. I heard from acquaintances that Lorena had left her house a few days after our conversation. Without my mother's trust, and without the means to support herself, she had sought shelter with a distant friend, someone who apparently still believed her excuses. Lorena, for so long, she had been the center of everything, the perfect daughter, the one who received all the attention and love I never managed to reach. Now she was reaping what she had sown. I didn't feel satisfaction knowing she was struggling. But I didn't feel guilt either. Every choice has its consequences, and Lorena was finally facing hers. As for my mother, I learned she was trying to mend her relationship with Lorena, but without success. Lorena didn't care. Whenever my mother tried to get closer, she used the same manipulation tactics, asking for money or favors. I think for the first time, My mother was beginning to understand how she had been used for so long. As for me, I decided it wasn't my role to save anyone. My mother and Lorena had their own journeys to follow, just as I had mine. But that didn't mean I was closing all doors. A new relationship, built on respect and truth, was still possible. But it depended on them, not me. My business continued to grow, and with it, my confidence in who I was. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I wasn't seeking approval or longing for recognition that never came. I discovered that the greatest victory wasn't being accepted by others. It was accepting myself. One day, while organizing the final details of my new home, I received a message from my mother. It was short, but it carried something I had never felt from her before: humility. Adriana, I hope you're well. I just wanted to say that I miss you and that if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. I'm trying to do better. I hope one day you can forgive me. I read the message several times, absorbing each word. I didn't reply immediately, not because I was hurt, but because I knew time was needed. For both of us. After all, this wasn't just my new beginning, it was ours. And for the first time, I had hope that, maybe one day, we could find a balance. Until then, I would continue walking my path, because I was finally free to be who I had always wanted to be. The story wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for me, that was more than enough.